Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. This is volume 185 of our True Crime Stories for Sleep. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. They are shared not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and help raise awareness of warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to talk about a case that shook a small community in Colorado. A case that reminds us how fragile safety can be, and how a community can come together in the face of unimaginable tragedy. This is the story of Jessica Ridgeway, a 10-year-old girl from Westminster, Colorado, who disappeared on a Friday morning in October of 2012. It's a story of loss, but also of determination, of thousands of people who refused to give up, and of investigators who worked tirelessly to find answers. Westminster, Colorado sits just northwest of Denver, a suburb that in 2012 was home to about 110,000 people. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children walk to school, where life moves at a manageable pace. The streets are lined with modest homes, parks dot the neighborhoods, and the Rocky Mountains rise in the distance. A constant reminder of the natural beauty that draws so many to Colorado. October 5th, 2012 was a Friday. The air was crisp with autumn, the kind of morning where you can see your breath, where the sun is bright but doesn't quite warm you yet. For 10-year-old Jessica Ridgeway, it was just another school day. Jessica lived with her mother, Sarah Ridgeway, in a small home on their quiet street. She was in 5th grade at Witt Elementary School, about a mile from their house. Jessica was a bright child, small for her age, with long blonde hair and glasses that framed her face. Those who knew her described her as sweet, responsible, and maybe a little shy. She loved to draw, loved animals, and had that particular kind of innocence that made her seem younger than her 10 years. That Friday morning, Sarah had to leave for work early. She worked as a nurse, and her shift started before Jessica needed to be at school. This wasn't unusual. Jessica was used to the routine. She would walk 3 blocks to a designated meeting spot at the corner of Dry Creek Road and Moore Street, where she'd meet other children and they'd walk together to Witt Elementary. It was a system that worked, a compromise between independence and safety. Sarah left for work around 7 in the morning. Jessica was awake, getting ready. The plan was simple and familiar. Jessica would leave the house around 8:15, walk to the meeting spot, and be at school by 8:45 when classes began. But Jessica never made it to school that day. When Jessica didn't arrive at school, the attendance office did what they always did. They called home, but Sarah was at work and the call went to voicemail. The school tried again. No answer. This wasn't immediately alarming. Sometimes parents forget to call in an absence. Sometimes there's a doctor's appointment that slips through the cracks. But as the morning progressed and there was still no word from Jessica or her mother, the school grew concerned. They called Sarah at work. It was around noon when Sarah finally got the message that Jessica wasn't at school. The confusion must have been immediate and visceral. Jessica had been home that morning. Sarah had seen her before leaving for work. There was no reason Jessica wouldn't have gone to school. Sarah called Jessica's friends, called neighbors, called anyone who might know where her daughter was. Nothing. No one had seen her. By 1:30 that afternoon, Sarah called the Westminster Police Department to report her daughter missing. The police response was swift. Missing child cases are treated with urgency because investigators know that time is the most critical factor. Every hour that passes decreases the likelihood of a safe recovery. Officers immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, talking to residents, looking for any sign of Jessica or anyone who might have seen her that morning. They traced what should have been her route from home to the meeting spot, 3 blocks. Such a short distance. Jessica had walked it many times before. The neighborhood was quiet. Residential, the kind of place where you'd think a child would be safe walking alone for a few minutes. But somewhere along those 3 blocks, something had gone terribly wrong. By that evening, as the sun set over Westminster, the search for Jessica Ridgeway had grown into a massive operation. The FBI was called in, as they often are in child abduction cases. The case met the criteria for an Amber Alert. A child under 18 had been abducted. There was enough descriptive information to potentially help locate her, and police believed she was in danger. The Amber Alert went out across Colorado and neighboring states. Jessica's description was broadcast on every news station, shared on social media, posted on highway signs. 10 years old, 4 feet 2 inches tall, weighing just 55 pounds. Blonde hair, glasses, last seen wearing a purple jacket, jeans, and purple boots. The community response was extraordinary. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to help search. They walked through neighborhoods, parks, open spaces, calling Jessica's name. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled overhead with thermal imaging cameras. Every shed, every garage, every possible place a child might be hidden or might have wandered to was checked and rechecked. Sarah Ridgeway appeared at press conferences, her face strained with fear and exhaustion, pleading for her daughter's safe return. She spoke directly to whoever had taken Jessica, begging them to let her come home. The pain in her voice was palpable. This wasn't just a news story to the people of Westminster. This was their neighbor, their daughter, their community member who was missing. Investigators worked around the clock. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed any available security camera footage from homes and businesses along Jessica's route, and followed up on hundreds of tips that poured in through the hotline. Every lead was pursued, no matter how unlikely. But as the weekend passed with no sign of Jessica, hope began to give way to a terrible dread. Statistics are cruel in cases like this. The longer a child is missing, the less likely the outcome will be positive. Investigators knew this. The community knew this. And somewhere, in a place she couldn't voice, Sarah Ridgeway must have known this too. On Wednesday, October 10th, 5 days after Jessica disappeared, workers at a water treatment facility in Arvada, a town about 7 miles from Westminster, found something horrifying in an open space area near their facility. It was a black garbage bag, and inside were human remains. The remains were so badly decomposed and dismembered that immediate identification wasn't possible. They would need DNA testing to confirm identity. But investigators feared what the community didn't yet want to believe, that these were Jessica's remains. The location where the remains were found was significant. It was far enough from Jessica's home and the route she would have walked. That morning that it suggested whoever was responsible had deliberately chosen a remote location for disposal. The body had been dismembered, which indicated a level of brutality and calculation that made this crime particularly disturbing. 2 days later, on Friday, October 12th, exactly 1 week after Jessica vanished, DNA testing confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Jessica Ridgeway. The news devastated the community. Vigils were held. People who had never met Jessica wept openly. The search had shifted from rescue to finding whoever had done this unthinkable thing to an innocent child. But even as the community mourned, investigators were working on another troubling development. On the same day, Jessica disappeared, just hours before her mother reported her missing. Something else had happened in Westminster that no one had yet connected to Jessica's case. On the morning of October 5th, a 22-year-old woman was jogging in a park in Westminster, not far from where Jessica lived. As she ran, a man approached her from behind. Before she could react, he grabbed her and tried to drag her toward a nearby wooded area. The woman fought. She fought hard. She screamed. She kicked. She scratched at her attacker. Her resistance worked. The man released her and ran off. The woman was able to get a look at him. White male, late teens or early 20s. Brown hair. Average build. She reported the attempted abduction to police, who took her statement and began investigating. At the time, this assault was treated as its own case. A frightening attack, certainly, but not immediately connected to the missing 5th grader from a few miles away. But now, with Jessica confirmed dead, investigators began to wonder. 2 attacks on the same morning, in the same general area, could they be related? The survivor's description of her attacker was crucial, and she had something even more valuable: DNA evidence. During her struggle, she had scratched her attacker deeply enough to get his skin cells under her fingernails. That DNA had been collected and was now in the system. Investigators also had another piece of evidence from the attempted abduction site, a cross necklace that had been left behind. It wasn't clear if it belonged to the victim or the attacker, but it was cataloged carefully in case it became relevant. Meanwhile, forensic teams were processing every piece of evidence from where Jessica's remains had been found. They were also investigating another disturbing discovery. On October 10th, the same day Jessica's remains were found in Arvada, someone had left a backpack in the front yard of a home in Superior, Colorado, another Denver suburb about 17 miles from Westminster. The homeowners in Superior found the backpack in their yard, and initially didn't think much of it. Kids sometimes cut through yards. Sometimes things get left behind. But when they looked inside, they found clothing and other personal items. And then they saw the news. They saw the reports about missing Jessica Ridgeway. They looked at the backpack again, looked at the items inside, and called the police. The backpack and its contents were sent for analysis. DNA testing and other forensic work confirmed that these items belonged to Jessica. But here's what was particularly significant about this backpack. It had been placed in that yard on October 10th, 5 days after Jessica disappeared. And on the same day, her remains were discovered in Arvada. This suggested something important to investigators. Whoever had taken Jessica hadn't discarded all evidence immediately. They had kept this backpack for days and then deliberately placed it in a residential area where it would be found. Was this some kind of message? Was the perpetrator taunting police? Or was it simply a panicked disposal of evidence once the body had been discovered? The location in Superior was also significant. The perpetrators seemed to be moving around the greater Denver metro area, leaving evidence in different jurisdictions. Westminster, where Jessica was taken; Arvada, where her body was found; Superior, where her backpack appeared. This suggested someone with a vehicle, someone who knew the area, someone who was mobile and calculating. Investigators were now working with multiple crime scenes across multiple cities, coordinating between different law enforcement agencies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to develop a profile of the killer. Based on the evidence, they believed they were looking for a white male, probably in his late teens to early 20s. Someone familiar with the area, someone organized enough to move evidence around, but who was also possibly devolving or panicking. The DNA evidence from the attempted assault on the jogger was the key. The DNA would be compared against every suspect, every person of interest, everyone who came under investigation. And investigators were about to get a break, though it would come from a deeply unexpected source. On October 19th, 14 days after Jessica disappeared, Westminster police received a phone call that would change everything. The caller was a woman, and she was worried about someone close to her. Someone whose behavior had become increasingly disturbing. Someone who had made comments that, in light of Jessica's murder, had taken on a sinister new meaning. The woman was calling about her 17-year-old son. Her name was Teresa Martin, and she lived in Westminster with her son Austin Reed Sigg. Teresa was a nurse, a responsible member of the community, and she was terrified that her own child might be connected to Jessica Ridgway's murder. What had led Teresa to make this call? In the days following Jessica's disappearance, she had noticed her son acting strangely. He had cleaned out his car obsessively. He had been extremely anxious, watching news coverage of the case constantly. And then there were things she had found: strange internet searches on the family computer, disturbing content about death and dismemberment. But perhaps most damning was something Austin had said to her directly. When news broke about Jessica's backpack being found in Superior, Austin had made a comment that stopped Teresa cold. He had specific knowledge about that backpack, details that hadn't been released to the public. Teresa Martin was faced with an impossible choice. This was her son. She had raised him, loved him, protected him for 17 years. But she also knew what was right. If there was even a possibility that Austin was involved in Jessica's death, she couldn't stay silent. How many parents would have the courage to make that call? When investigators heard Teresa's concerns, they acted immediately. They obtained a warrant to collect DNA from Austin Sigg, to compare it against the DNA from the jogger attack. And on October 23rd, they came to the Martin home to execute that warrant, but they didn't need to use it. When police arrived and explained why they were there, Austin Sigg confessed almost immediately. Austin Reed Sigg was 17 years old. He lived with his mother in Westminster, less than a mile and a half from where Jessica Ridgeway had lived. He had dropped out of high school the previous year and was mostly isolated at home, spending his time online, becoming increasingly withdrawn. When police sat down with him, Austin didn't deny what he'd done. In fact, he provided a detailed confession that was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. On the morning of October 5th, Austin had left his house with a plan. He was driving his mother's car, looking for a victim. He saw Jessica walking alone on her way to the meeting spot where she was supposed to meet other children. He pulled up beside her. What exactly he said to Jessica, we don't know for certain, but somehow he got this 10-year-old girl into his car. Perhaps he offered her a ride to school. Perhaps he said he knew her mother. Perhaps he simply grabbed her. Whatever happened, Jessica ended up in Austin's vehicle. He drove her back to his home. His mother was at work. The house was empty. What happened next is difficult to recount, but it's important to understand the full scope of this crime. Austin took Jessica into his home, and there he killed her. He later told police that he strangled her with his hands. Jessica Ridgeway, this small 10-year-old child who should have been sitting in her 5th grade classroom, who should have been drawing or playing with friends or living a normal childhood, died in a stranger's house, terrified and alone. But Austin didn't stop there. In what can only be described as an act of profound depravity, he dismembered Jessica's body in the bathtub. He had researched how to do this. He had planned it. He then placed the remains in garbage bags and drove to Arvada, where he left them in that open space near the water treatment facility. He kept some of Jessica's belongings, including her backpack, at his home for several days. On October 10th, he drove to Superior and left the backpack in that random front yard, perhaps thinking that spreading evidence across multiple jurisdictions would confuse investigators. Austin also confessed to the attempted abduction of the jogger that same morning. That attack, he explained, had been his first attempt. When the woman fought back and escaped, he hadn't given up. Instead, he had kept looking, and within hours he had encountered Jessica, a victim who couldn't fight back, who couldn't escape. The confession was detailed, thorough, and horrifying. But perhaps most disturbing were Austin's explanations for why he had done this. He told investigators he had fantasies about kidnapping and killing someone. He had been planning something like this for years, consuming increasingly violent content online, researching methods, feeding a dark obsession that had finally driven him to act. Austin Sigg was charged as an adult with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Despite being 17, the severity of the crimes and the calculated nature of his actions meant he would be tried in adult court. In November of 2013, more than a year after Jessica's death, Austin Sigg stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to all charges. There would be no trial, no lengthy court proceedings. He admitted his guilt fully. At his sentencing hearing, the courtroom was filled with Jessica's family, community members, and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case. Sarah Ridgeway gave a victim impact statement that described her loss in terms that no parent should ever have to speak. She talked about Jessica's smile, her kindness, her potential, all snuffed out by senseless violence. The judge sentenced Austin Sigg to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 17, his life as a free person was over. Just as he had ended Jessica's life when she was only 10. He would also serve additional consecutive sentences for the kidnapping and the attack on the jogger, ensuring that he would never be released. There was no satisfaction in this sentence, no sense of victory. Jessica was still gone. A little girl who loved to draw, who was responsible enough to walk herself to school, who had her whole life ahead of her. She was still dead. The sentence couldn't change that. It could only ensure that Austin Sigg would never harm anyone else. The Jessica Ridgeway case left lasting impacts on the Westminster community and beyond. Schools changed their safety protocols. Parents became more vigilant. The case sparked conversations about how communities can balance children's independence with their safety. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated both the power of community involvement and the critical importance of DNA evidence. Without the survivor of the attempted abduction, that brave woman who fought off her attacker and provided DNA evidence, linking Austin Sigg to Jessica's murder would have been far more difficult. And then there's Teresa Martin, Austin's mother, who made a choice that no parent should ever have to make. She could have stayed silent. She could have protected her son, convincing herself that he couldn't be involved, that it was just coincidence, that her suspicions were wrong. But she didn't. She called the police, and in doing so, she ensured that Jessica's killer was caught. It's impossible to imagine the guilt, the grief, the confusion Teresa must have felt, and probably still feels. She raised this child. Where had she gone wrong? Could she have seen the signs earlier? Could she have prevented this? These are questions she'll likely grapple with for the rest of her life. But the truth is that Austin Sigg's actions were his own. He made choices, fed his dark obsessions, and ultimately acted on his violent fantasies. His mother's decision to report him was an act of tremendous courage and moral clarity. She chose the right thing over the easy thing, the truth over comfortable denial. As we come to the end of this story, it's worth sitting with what it means. Jessica Ridgeway was 10 years old. 10. She was doing something that children have done for generations. Walking to school on a Friday morning. Her mother trusted the neighborhood, trusted the system of walking with other kids, trusted that 3 blocks in the daylight would be safe, and it should have been safe. In a just world, it would have been safe. But we don't live in a purely just world. We live in a world where sometimes darkness exists in unexpected places, where a 17-year-old boy can nurture such violent fantasies that he acts on them without apparent remorse, where a mother's worst nightmare isn't something happening to her child, but rather something her child has done. The Jessica Ridgeway case reminds us of several things. It reminds us that communities can come together in remarkable ways when tragedy strikes. Thousands of people searched for Jessica, contributed tips, supported her family. It reminds us that law enforcement officers work tirelessly on these cases, following every lead, processing every piece of evidence, driven by a determination to find justice for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. It reminds us that survivors matter. That woman who was attacked in the park, who fought back, who provided the DNA evidence that would eventually help identify Jessica's killer. Her courage and quick thinking were crucial to solving this case. It reminds us that sometimes the hardest moral choices fall to people in impossible positions, and that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the easy thing. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we need to remember the victims as people, not just as names in news stories. Jessica Ridgeway was a person. She had favorite colors and favorite foods and friends who missed her and a mother who loved her. She had dreams about what she'd be when she grew up, stories she would have told, drawings she would have made, a life she would have lived. That life was stolen from her on a Friday morning in October. And while Austin Sigg will spend the rest of his life behind bars, Jessica will never grow up, never go to middle school or high school, never go to prom or graduate or fall in love or have children of her own or do any of the thousands of ordinary and extraordinary things that make up a human life. That's what was lost. That's what we remember. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're going to explore one of Britain's most haunting cases, a story that unfolded slowly over decades in the quiet streets of Gloucester, England. This is a story about secrets hidden in plain sight, about an ordinary-looking house that harbored unimaginable darkness, and about the long journey toward justice. Take a deep breath, let your eyes close if they haven't already, and let's begin. Our story starts not with an ending, but with a beginning, in the English countryside of the 1940s. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on the 29th of September, 1941, in a small cottage in Muchmarkel, Herefordshire. He grew up among rolling green fields, the eldest surviving child in a family of farm workers. To the outside world, the West family seemed unremarkable, just another rural family making their way through post-war Britain. But even in those early years, there were whispers, fragments of something darker beneath the surface. Fred, as he was known, was his mother's favorite, doted upon in ways that some would later suggest crossed uncomfortable boundaries. His childhood was marked by two significant accidents. At 17, he suffered a serious motorcycle crash that left him in a coma for a week. Later, he endured another head injury that would give him seizures for the rest of his life. These injuries, some would argue, may have affected his behavior, though many experts remain skeptical that trauma alone could explain what came later. As a young man, Fred worked various jobs, learning the trades of construction and building that would serve him throughout his life. He had a way about him, a charm that belied his rough appearance. He was often dirty from his work, with unkempt hair and clothes that had seen better days. But he could talk to people, make them feel at ease. It was a talent that would prove dangerous. In 1962, at 21 years old, Fred married for the first time. Her name was Catherine Costello, though everyone called her Rena. She was 18 and pregnant with another man's child when they met in Scotland. Fred was working as an ice cream van driver, a job that gave him access to young people, especially teenage girls. The marriage was troubled from the start. Rena struggled with Fred's intense and unusual sexual demands, his need for control, his sudden violent outbursts. They had a daughter together in 1964, Anna Marie, but Fred was already having affairs, already showing signs of the violence that would escalate. There were reports in Gloucester around this time, 8 different incidents of assault where the description of the perpetrator matched Fred West, though he was never connected to these crimes. The couple employed a young Scottish girl as a nanny, a 16-year-old named Anne McFall. She came from a difficult background, having spent time in a children's home in Aberdeen, where she endured harsh treatment from the nuns who ran it. Anne was vulnerable, lonely, looking for stability and kindness. She thought she found it with the Wests, helping to care for Charmaine and Anna Marie. But Fred's attention soon turned toward Anne. By early 1967, Anne was pregnant with Fred's child. She wanted him to leave Rena, to marry her instead, to build a proper life together. Fred, however, had different plans. In July of 1967, 18-year-old Anne McFall, 8 months pregnant, vanished. She was never reported missing. Her family in Scotland simply stopped hearing from her. Rena returned to live with Fred, and life continued as if Anne had never existed. It would be 27 years before anyone knew what happened to Anne McFall. When her remains were finally found in a field near Muchmarkel, investigators discovered something that would become Fred West's signature. Her fingers and toes had been carefully removed, severed with precision, likely kept as trophies. Anne McFall was Fred West's first known victim. She would not be his last. The marriage between Fred and Rena continued to deteriorate through the late 1960s. They separated frequently, with Rena often returning to Scotland. Fred was left to care for the 2 young girls, Charmaine and Anna Marie, though care might be too generous a word. He would lock them in a makeshift cage fashioned from bunk beds, keeping them confined while he worked. Then, in 1969, at a bus stop in Cheltenham, Fred met someone who would change everything. Her name was Rosemary Letts, though everyone called her Rose. She was just 15 years old. Rose came from her own troubled background. Her father was a schizophrenic disciplinarian who ruled their home with violence and fear. Her mother suffered from severe depression. Rose herself showed signs of instability from a young age, rocking compulsively as a child, struggling with her temper. When Fred approached her at that bus stop, she was working in a cake shop, just a teenager trying to navigate her difficult home life. Fred was 27, twice her age. By all accounts, he was dirty and unkempt. Not the sort of person most teenage girls would give a second glance. But Rose was flattered by his attention, by the way he pursued her persistently, showing up at the shop where she worked, asking her out again and again. Eventually, she agreed to go on a date with him. It was by Fred's own later account on Rose's 16th birthday that they first went out together. A month later, she was pregnant. Rose's father was furious. He contacted social services. He threatened Fred directly. but nothing could stop what was already in motion. Shortly after her 16th birthday, Rose left her parents' home and moved into Fred's trailer with him and his 2 daughters. On the 17th of October, 1970, Rose gave birth to a daughter they named Heather. She was not yet 17 years old, suddenly responsible for 3 children, including 2 who weren't her own. The pressure was immense. Rose had violent tendencies, a temper that could erupt without warning. The children bore the brunt of it. In 1971, Fred was sent to prison for theft and fine evasion, leaving Rose alone with the 3 girls. It was during this time, while Fred was locked away, that 8-year-old Charmaine disappeared. When neighbors asked about her, Rose told them the child had been taken away to be with her mother, Regina. But that wasn't true. When Fred was released from prison, he quietly disposed of Charmaine's body, removing her fingers and toes as he had with Ann McFall, then burying her beneath the kitchen floor of their home on Midland Road. The little girl, Rena's daughter, had been murdered by Rose in one of her violent rages. Not long after, when Rena came looking for Charmaine, she too disappeared. Fred strangled her, dismembered her body, and buried her in the same field where Ann McFall lay hidden. On the 29th of January, 1972, Fred and Rose were married. She was 18 years old. Their second daughter together, May, was born in June. And that same year, they moved into a new home, a 3-story house that would become infamous around the world. 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. 25 Cromwell Street was a large Victorian terrace house in a working-class neighborhood of Gloucester. It was the kind of place that would blend in, unremarkable from the outside. The West needed the space for their growing family and for the lodgers they planned to take in to help with rent. But this house would become something else entirely. It would become a chamber of torture, a tomb for the innocent, a place where nightmares became real. Fred converted rooms, built extensions, dug out the cellar. He was always renovating, always building, and no one questioned why. Rose set up a room on the ground floor where she worked as a prostitute. Encouraged by Fred, who would listen from the next room or sometimes watch, they placed a red light outside the door to warn the children to stay away when Rose was busy. Their relationship had evolved into something deeply disturbing. Fred later told police that he had trained Rose to do what he wanted, that she had blended into his way of living. They shared increasingly violent sexual practices, bondage and sadism that eventually extended beyond their own relationship. In late 1972, they hired a 17-year-old girl named Caroline Owens as a nanny. Caroline was young, vulnerable, in need of work. What happened to her would set the pattern for what was to come. One day, Caroline was assaulted by both Fred and Rose. She was stripped, bound, gagged, and raped. They told her she would be killed and buried under the paving stones. Somehow, Caroline managed to escape. She reported what happened to the police, and Fred and Rose West were arrested and charged with rape and assault. But in January 1973, when the case came to court, Caroline found she couldn't face testifying. The charges were reduced to indecent assault. Fred, with his working-class charm, convinced the magistrate that Caroline had consented. Both he and Rose were fined £50 each. They walked out of court free. Caroline Owens survived. She would carry the weight of that survival for decades, struggling with guilt that she had been spared when others had not. 3 months later, in April 1973, the West committed their first murder together at Cromwell Street. Her name was Linda Goff, a 19-year-old seamstress who had been seeing one of their lodgers. She moved into the house on the 19th of April. Within days, she was dead. When Linda's mother came looking for her daughter, Rose answered the door, wearing Linda's slippers. She explained that Linda had left after hitting one of the children, but Linda Goff was buried in the cellar, her jaw wrapped completely in tape to silence her screams. Small tubes inserted in her nose to allow her to breathe during her torture. Over the next 5 years, more young women would disappear into 25 Cromwell Street. They had names, lives, families who loved them. Carol Ann Cooper, just 15 years old, a schoolgirl from Worcester, vanished in November 1973 while trying to catch a bus home. Lucy Partington, 21, a university student and the cousin of novelist Martin Amis, disappeared in December 1973. After visiting a friend, she had gone to catch a bus and was never seen again. Therese Siegenthaler, 21, a Swiss student hitchhiking through England, disappeared in 1974. Shirley Hubbard, just 15, on work experience in Worcester, vanished in November 1974. When her remains were found, her entire head had been wrapped in tape, with a narrow tube inserted deep into her nasal cavity to allow her to breathe. Juanita Mott, 18, a former lodger at Cromwell Street, disappeared in April 1975 while hitchhiking. Shirley Robinson, another lodger, 18 years old and 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, was murdered in May 1978. Rose had grown jealous of Shirley, resentful of the pregnancy. The baby, a little girl, was removed from Shirley's body and buried with her mother beneath the garden paving stones. Allison Chambers, 16, originally from Germany, disappeared in 1979. Each of these young women endured unimaginable suffering before they died. They were bound, tortured, subjected to violent sexual assault. Their bodies were carefully dismembered, bones removed, arranged in specific ways before burial. Some had masks of tape wrapped entirely around their heads, with small tubes allowing just enough air to keep them alive through their ordeal. And through it all, the West children were growing up in that house, learning to navigate its dangers, developing dark jokes about the sounds they heard from the cellar, about the smell that sometimes came from beneath the floorboards. By the early 1980s, Fred and Rose had a large family living at Cromwell Street. There were 10 children in total, some from previous relationships, most born to Fred and Rose together. The children included Anna Marie, Heather, May, Stephen, Barry, Tara, Louise, Rosemary Jr., and Luciana. Life in that house was a carefully maintained performance. To neighbors, the West seemed like an ordinary couple with a big, chaotic family. Fred worked as a builder, always cheerful, always ready with a joke. Rose looked after the children and saw her clients. They attended school events. They paid their bills, they blended in. But inside 25 Cromwell Street, horror was routine. The children were physically abused, beaten regularly by Rose, who would lose control of her temper and find it difficult to stop hitting them. Stephen West would later recall that school felt safer than home, that they all felt relief when they could leave the house each morning. Worse still was the sexual abuse. Fred systematically assaulted his daughter Anna Marie from the time she was 8 years old, raping her repeatedly over years. He told her it was normal, that fathers taught their daughters about sex. When she was 15, Fred got her pregnant. She was forced to have an abortion. By the mid-1980s, Fred had turned his attention to his daughter with Rose. Heather, along with May. The two girls endured Fred's assaults. The sisters made a pact that they wouldn't let him get away with it, that they would tell someone, that they would stop him. Heather was 16, rebellious, determined to escape. She talked about leaving home, about getting away from her parents. She confided in people that she was unhappy, though she never revealed the full extent of what was happening to her. On a day in June 1987, Heather disappeared. Fred and Rose told different stories about where she'd gone. Sometimes she was in Devon, working at a holiday camp. Sometimes she'd moved to the Midlands with a girlfriend. The stories changed depending on who was asking, but the other West children knew a darker truth. Their parents had a joke they would repeat, a family joke that made them all uncomfortable. "You'll end up under the patio like Heather," Fred would say, laughing, when the children misbehaved. The years passed. The children grew older. Some of them left home as soon as they could. Anna Marie tried to find information about her mother, Rana, about her half-sister, Charmaine, about Heather. She found nothing. They had all simply vanished. In May 1992, Fred raped his 13-year-old daughter, Louise. She told Rose what had happened, hoping for protection, for help. Rose's response was cold. "You were asking for it." Louise told her siblings. Word got out. Social services were contacted. In August 1992, Detective Constable Hazel Savage led a search of 25 Cromwell Street. She was a dedicated officer, tenacious, the sort of person who didn't let cases go once they got under her skin. The search uncovered pornography and evidence of child abuse. Fred was arrested for rape and sodomy of a minor. Rose was arrested for assisting in the rape of a minor. Their younger children were removed from the home and placed in foster care. During the investigation, Savage uncovered the extent of the abuse Anna Marie had suffered. She also learned about the disappearances of Charmaine and Heather, and those rumors about bodies under the patio. Something didn't add up, but the case fell apart. 2 key witnesses refused to testify. The children, terrified of their parents, refused to cooperate. The charges were dropped, and Fred and Rose walked free once again. Hazel Savage didn't let it go. She continued investigating Heather's disappearance. She discovered that Heather's national insurance number had never been used after 1987. The girl hadn't claimed unemployment benefits, hadn't registered for any job, for someone supposedly working at holiday camps and traveling around. This made no sense. Savage was convinced Heather was dead. She was convinced the family joke about bodies under the patio was true. She began pushing for a warrant to search the property again, to dig up the garden. Her colleagues were skeptical, but Savage persisted. Finally, on the 23rd of February, 1994, Gloucester police obtained a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street. They were looking for Heather West. On the 24th of February, 1994, Fred West came to the police station voluntarily in response to questions about Heather's whereabouts. In recorded interviews, he called the idea that Heather was under the patio rubbish. He said, "If you find her, I'll be happy." That evening, police began digging in the garden behind 25 Cromwell Street. They worked through the night but found nothing. Fred was sent home. The next day, the 25th of February, officers returned. They continued digging. Fred was at home, watching them through the window. Then, according to Detective Assistant Darren Law, who was present, Fred approached them. In his own living room, he said quietly, "I did kill Heather, but you're digging in the wrong place." Fred West was arrested and taken into custody. What followed was a confession that would shake Britain to its core. Fred admitted that there were more bodies. He directed police to continue digging in the garden and to search the cellar. He was calm, almost matter of fact, as he described what they would find. Over the next several days, police uncovered human remains, then more remains, then more. The investigation expanded from a single missing person case to a serial murder inquiry of staggering proportions. By March, they had found 9 bodies at Cromwell Street. 3 were buried under the paving stones in the garden. Heather West, Shirley Robinson, and Allison Chambers. 6 more were unearthed from the cellar. Linda Goff, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, and Juanita Mott. Fred cooperated with investigators, leading them to other locations. They went to the house on Midland Road where he and Rose had lived before Cromwell Street. There, under the kitchen floor, they found Tremaine West. Fred led them to fields near his birthplace in Muchmarkel. There they found Anne McFall and Rena Costello, both buried in rural graves, both missing their fingers and toes. 12 victims in total. 12 young women and girls who had trusted the wrong people, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose lives had been cut brutally short. The work of identifying the remains was painstaking. Many of the bodies had been dismembered and disturbed over the years. As Fred had conducted his endless renovations, bones were missing. Some had been removed deliberately, perhaps kept as trophies. The forensic teams worked for months to piece together identities, to match remains with missing persons reports, to finally give names back to the dead. Throughout it all, Fred gave over 100 hours of recorded interviews. Sometimes he claimed responsibility for everything, insisting Rose knew nothing. Other times he hinted that Rose was the driving force, the one who had pushed him further than he would have gone alone. His story shifted constantly. He also hinted at more victims. At one point he suggested there were 20 additional bodies spread around different locations. When asked directly, he would become cryptic, change the subject, or claim he couldn't remember details. Investigators believed him. They believed there were likely more victims whose bodies had never been found. Young women who had disappeared without a trace, whose families still waited for answers that would never come. Through the early days of the investigation, Rose West maintained that she was innocent, that she knew nothing about the murders, that she was as much a victim as anyone. But investigators didn't believe her. There were too many bodies, too many years, too many victims. How could she not know what was happening in her own house? In the cellar beneath her feet, in the garden where her children played. There was also Charmaine. Fred had been in prison when that little girl disappeared. He couldn't have killed her. Rose was the only one who could have. On the 20th of April, 1994, Rose West was arrested. Initially, it was for child abuse charges dating back to the 1970s. The next day, she was formally charged with murder, specifically the murder of Linda Goff. She was denied bail and transferred to a maximum security prison. Over the following weeks, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with multiple counts of murder. On the 30th of June 1994, they appeared together in magistrate's court for the first time since their arrests. Fred, according to witnesses, was desperate for any acknowledgement from Rose. He leaned toward her, placed his hand gently on her shoulder. Rose visibly flinched, refusing even to look at him. That rejection wounded Fred deeply. He had spent months protecting her, claiming she was innocent, insisting he had acted alone. But Rose's public distancing from him, her refusal to stand by him, changed something. Fred was transferred to Winson Green Prison in Birmingham to await trial. He was placed under strict suicide watch, with officers checking his cell every 15 minutes. On the 1st of January, 1995, a guard looked through the observation window of Fred West's cell and saw him hanging from the bars. He had used strips torn from a blanket, knotted together to form a rope. He had asphyxiated himself slowly during one of those 15-minute gaps in observation. Frederick West was dead. He had escaped justice, escaped trial, escaped having to face the families of his victims in court, and he had left Rose to face everything alone. Rose West's trial began on the 3rd of October, 1995 at Winchester Crown Court. She was charged with 10 counts of murder. Charmaine West, Heather West, Linda Goff, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Robinson, and Allison Chambers. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting forensic evidence, testimony from survivors, and accounts from family members and former lodgers. Caroline Owens, who had escaped the Wests in 1972, testified about her ordeal. She described being bound, assaulted by both Fred and Rose, threatened with death. Though she had received money for her story, she explained that she felt crushing guilt for surviving, that she needed to speak for those who hadn't made it out. Anna Marie West testified about years of sexual abuse at the hands of both her father and her stepmother. Other witnesses, including Rose's own mother and sister, provided testimony about Rose's character and capacity for violence. The prosecution argued that the methodology used to bind, torture, and kill the victims was consistent across cases, suggesting both Fred and Rose's involvement. This similar fact evidence demonstrated a pattern, a shared method of operation. Rose's defense counsel argued that Fred had committed the murders alone, that Rose had been manipulated and controlled by him, that she was also a victim. But there were significant problems with this argument. Most importantly, Fred had been in prison when Charmaine was killed. Rose was the only one who could have murdered that 8-year-old child. Against her lawyer's advice, Rose took the stand to testify in her own defense. She wore black, and she was easily angered by the prosecution's questions. Her testimony did not go well. She claimed to know nothing about the murders, to have never met at least 6 of the victims. She insisted she loved Heather, that she would never hurt her own daughter. But surviving witnesses testified that Rose had been the more aggressive perpetrator in sexual assaults. Former lodgers described her violent temper, her capacity for cruelty. The evidence against her was overwhelming. On the 22nd of November, 1995, after deliberating, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. On all 10 counts of murder, Rose West showed no emotion. She was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order, meaning she would never be eligible for parole. The judge recommended she never be released. In 1997, then Home Secretary Jack Straw confirmed that Rose West would spend the rest of her life behind bars. There would be no possibility of freedom, no chance of redemption. The house at 25 Cromwell Street stood for a short time after the trials, a grim monument to the horrors that had taken place there. But eventually the decision was made to demolish it completely. In October 1996, the building was torn down, every brick and beam destroyed. The rubble was crushed and buried in a secret location to prevent any souvenirs being taken. A walkway now occupies the space where that house of horrors once stood. There is no memorial, no marker. The city of Gloucester wanted to erase the physical reminder of Fred and Rose West, to reclaim that space from their evil, but the scars remain. The families of the victims have had to live with their loss for decades now, with the knowledge of how their loved ones suffered, with the agony of detailed forensic reports and trial testimonies that left nothing to imagination. The West children have struggled to move forward with their lives. Some have changed their names, desperate to escape the association with their parents. Anna Marie has spoken publicly about her experiences, hoping to help other abuse survivors. But most of the siblings have chosen silence, unwilling to relive their trauma. Relationships between the siblings fractured under the weight of shared horror. Some have never spoken to each other again, unable to bear the reminder of what they endured. They scattered across Britain, trying to build new lives from the ashes of their childhoods. Detective Constable Hazel Savage, the officer whose persistence had finally brought the West to justice, found her own life complicated by the case. Her career was later tarnished by allegations that she attempted to sell her story of the investigation. She retired after 34 years of service, forever linked to one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations. Rose West remains in prison, now 71 years old. She has always maintained her innocence, claiming that Fred committed all the murders alone, that she knew nothing. She has appealed her convictions multiple times. Each appeal denied. She will die in prison, likely at HMP Low Newton in County Durham, where she is currently held. Over the years, there have been continued investigations into whether Fred and Rose West killed more victims than the 12 known deaths. Some researchers and journalists believe they may have been responsible for other disappearances, including 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, who vanished from a bus stop in Gloucester in January 1968. Fred worked at the cafe where Mary worked, and there is circumstantial evidence linking him to her disappearance. But her body has never been found. In 2021, police excavated a cafe in Gloucester following a tip that Mary Bastholm might be buried there, but the search yielded no remains. The mystery of what happened to her remains unsolved. The question haunts the case: how many more victims were there? Fred hinted at 20 additional murders. He said bodies were spread around different locations, but he died without revealing the truth, taking those secrets to his grave. What makes people like Fred and Rose West? How do ordinary human beings become capable of such sustained cruelty, such calculated torture, such complete disregard for human life? These questions have occupied criminal psychologists, forensic experts, and true crime researchers for decades. There are theories, but no satisfying answers. Fred West grew up in a difficult environment, possibly suffered abuse, definitely endured significant head injuries, but many people experience trauma without becoming serial killers. His charm and manipulation skills allowed him to evade justice for years, to convince magistrates and police that accusations against him were false, to maintain a facade of normality even as he buried bodies beneath his home. Rose West came from a violent, unstable family. She was young when she met Fred, still developing, and she fell under his influence at a formative time in her life. Some argue she was groomed by Fred, shaped into a partner for his crimes. Others point to evidence that Rose was independently violent and sadistic, that she may have even encouraged Fred to go further than he might have alone. The truth is likely somewhere in between. They found in each other a terrible compatibility, a shared darkness that fed on itself and grew more extreme over time. What started as unconventional sexual practices escalated to assault, then to imprisonment, then to torture, and finally to murder. Each crime made the next one easier. Each body they buried made them bolder. They targeted vulnerable young women, girls without strong family connections, runaways, hitchhikers, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. They exploited trust, offering a room, a job, a kindness that masked predatory intentions. And they did it for years, untouched by justice, protected by luck and their own cur manipulation of those around them. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Fred and Rose West case is how ordinary they seemed. Neighbors described them as normal, even friendly. Their house was always busy with children and lodgers. Fred was a hard worker. Rose managed a large household. They paid their bills, participated in the community, blended into the fabric of working-class Gloucester life. Evil, this case reminds us, does not always announce itself. It does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the house next door, the couple down the street, the ordinary people we pass without a second glance. And so our story comes to an end, though the reverberations of what happened at 25 Cromwell Street continue to echo through the decades. The victims are remembered not for how they died, but for who they were. Young women with hopes and dreams, with families who loved them, with lives that should have stretched ahead for years. Anne McFall, Catherine Costello, Charmaine West, Linda Goff, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Robinson, Allison Chambers, and Heather West. Say their names quietly now. A small remembrance for lives stolen too soon. The case of Fred and Rose West stands as one of Britain's most shocking crime sprees. A reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors, and the importance of listening when people, especially children, try to tell us something is wrong. Take a slow breath now. Let this story settle. Let it remind you that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still arrive. That evil, though it may flourish for a time, does not ultimately win. That the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can be uncovered. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, we find ourselves reflecting on stories that change the world. Tonight we explore one such story. A tale that began in the ordinary suburbs of British Columbia, Canada, and rippled across continents, touching millions of hearts and changing the way we think about the digital world we inhabit. This is the story of Amanda Todd. It's a story about childhood, mistakes, cruelty, and ultimately about a voice that refused to be silenced, even in death. Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a city of modest homes and quiet neighborhoods, where families raised their children far from the chaos of Vancouver proper. It was here on the 27th of November, 1996, that Amanda Michelle Todd was born. Her parents, Norm and Carol Todd, like so many couples, eventually grew apart. They separated when Amanda was young, but both remained devoted to their daughter. Amanda spent most of her time with her mother, though for about 2 years she lived with her father. She was a girl who loved to sing, who found joy in music and expressing herself through art and multimedia. She was a cheerleader with the Vancouver All-Stars squad, athletic and spirited, but beneath that energetic exterior, Amanda struggled. She had a language-based learning disability that made school difficult. Carol, herself a teacher who worked with children facing learning challenges, understood her daughter's pain. Amanda often found herself at the bottom of her class, and this created a persistent anxiety, a shadow that followed her through the hallways of her school. She became the target of jokes from other students. Not cruel, perhaps, in their minds, but wearing nonetheless. Day after day, small comments that chipped away at her confidence. Amanda didn't feel she had a normal life. She was searching for something, acceptance, friendship, a place where she belonged. In 7th grade, when Amanda was around 12 years old, she discovered something that many young people of her generation found: the ability to connect with others through webcam chat rooms. This was the late 2000s, when social media was exploding, when YouTube was becoming a household name, when Facebook was transforming how people, especially young people, interacted with the world. For Amanda, these chat rooms offered something she craved: attention, validation, a sense of being seen. Strangers online told her she was stunning, beautiful, perfect. After years of feeling inadequate at school, after being the butt of jokes, these compliments felt like water in a desert. But among the friendly voices, there was one that stood out. A man, someone older, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He was patient, kind at first, building trust, and then one day he asked Amanda to do something. Just once, he said, just flash for the camera. And Amanda, seeking approval, seeking that validation, did. One moment, one decision. In the space of a few seconds, everything changed. A year passed. Amanda was in 8th grade now, navigating the already complicated world of adolescence. She had probably forgotten about that moment, pushed it into the back of her mind as an embarrassing mistake, something she hoped would simply fade away. Then, on Christmas break in 2010, a message arrived on Facebook. A message from a stranger who somehow knew everything about her. Her name, her address, her school, the names of her friends and family members. And attached to that message was a photo. The photo, the one she'd taken that one time a year earlier. The stranger's message was clear. Do what I want. Put on a show for me, or I will send this photo to everyone you know. Every friend, every family member, everyone at your school. Amanda was terrified. This was no longer a mistake she could hide from. This was blackmail, though she might not have known that word yet. This was a trap, and she was caught in it. When she refused, the stranger kept his promise. Imagine, for a moment, being 13 years old. Imagine your most private moment, your biggest mistake, suddenly exposed to your entire world. Friends, classmates, teachers, family. The photo went viral in Amanda's community. It spread through Facebook like wildfire, shared and reshared, commented on, mocked. The other kids at school saw it. They talked about it. They laughed about it, and then came the bullying. In her later video, Amanda would describe how people called her names, how they wouldn't let her forget. The teenage cruelty that can be so casually devastating. She became known not as Amanda, the girl who loved to sing, but as Amanda, the girl in that photo. Her mother, Carol, found out about the sextortion in December of 2010 after receiving a Facebook message with a link to Amanda's topless image. The image had been posted to an adult website. Amanda's friends had received the photo too and had called the police. Officers arrived at Carol's home for a safety check. At first, Amanda wouldn't talk much about what was happening, but as the photo circulated throughout their community, as the harassment intensified, she finally opened up to her parents about the nightmare she was living through. Amanda began to spiral. She developed severe depression and anxiety. She started using drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. The bright musical girl who had once cheered with such energy was fading, replaced by someone haunted, someone who couldn't escape her past no matter how hard she tried. Her parents made the difficult decision to move her to a new school, a fresh start. They hoped a chance to leave the bullying behind and begin again. For a while, things seemed better. Amanda made new friends. She started to rebuild her life piece by piece. She allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But the predator wasn't finished with her. After about a year, the same stranger returned. He created a Facebook profile using Amanda's topless photo as his profile picture. Then he sent friend requests to everyone in Amanda's new school. Her new friends, people who knew nothing about her past. Overnight, her fresh start was destroyed. The messages from the predator were chilling in their persistence. More than 700 messages over the course of their contact, sent through Facebook, YouTube, and Skype. One message read, "You already forgot who I am. The guy who last year made you change school. Give me 3 shows and I will disappear forever. If you go to a new school, new boyfriend, new friends, new whatever, I will be there again." I am crazy, yes. This wasn't random bullying. This was targeted, systematic torture. This was a predator who had made Amanda his project, who found satisfaction in her suffering, who planned each step of her humiliation with careful deliberation. Amanda's new classmates turned on her. The whisper started again. The names. People called her a porn star and a cam whore. She ate lunch alone. She cried every night. She lost all respect people had for her. Lost all her friends. She began cutting herself, trying to make the internal pain external, trying to feel something other than the crushing weight of shame and isolation. "I can never get that photo back," she would later write. "It's out there forever." In the midst of all this darkness, Amanda made what she would later call a huge mistake. There was a boy at her school. He seemed to like her, seemed to pay attention to her when no one else would. They hooked up in the language teenagers use, but the boy had a girlfriend. A week later, Amanda received a text message telling her to get out of school. When she arrived the next day, a group of students was waiting for her. They surrounded her, led by the boy's girlfriend. "Look around," the girlfriend said. "Nobody likes you." Then someone in the crowd, a male student, yelled, "Just punch her already." And she did. Amanda was physically beaten in front of her peers. She fell to the ground. She lay there in a ditch while students stood around, filming, watching, doing nothing to help. She walked home alone and, in a moment of absolute despair, tried to take her own life by drinking bleach. Her mother found her and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save her. They did save her body, but something inside Amanda had broken beyond repair. When Amanda returned to school after recovering, she found that images of her lying in the ditch had been posted online. Students suggested she should try a different bleach and try a different ditch. The cruelty was relentless, creative in its viciousness. Amanda's parents moved her again. Another school, another attempt at a fresh start. But by now, Amanda was drowning. The anxiety, the depression, the panic attacks, they consumed her. She rarely left home. She turned more heavily to drugs and alcohol. On the 7th of September, 2012, 15-year-old Amanda Todd did something extraordinary. She recorded a video. It was 9 minutes long, filmed in black and white. Amanda never spoke a single word in it. Instead, she held up a series of handwritten flashcards, one after another, telling her story in her own words. The video began simply, "Hello. I've decided to tell you about my never-ending story." Card by card, she walked through her nightmare. The webcam chats in 7th grade, the stranger who convinced her to flash, the photo that followed her everywhere, the blackmail, the bullying, the move to a new school, the predator who found her again, the new friends who abandoned her, the boy who used her, the beating, the bleach, the online mockery. Near the end of the video, the cards became more desperate. Every day I think, why am I still here? I'm stuck. What's left of me now? Nothing stops. I have nobody. I need someone. And then the final card, the one that ensured the world would never forget her name. My name is Amanda Todd. She uploaded the video to YouTube with the title "My Story: Struggling, Bullying, Suicide, Self-Harm." In the description she wrote, "I'm struggling to stay in this world, because everything just touches me so deeply. Haters are haters, but please don't hate." Amanda was trying to tell her story, trying to take control of the narrative that had been stolen from her. She was trying to warn other children, to help them avoid the trap she'd fallen into. She was trying to be heard. On October 10th, 2012, just 33 days after posting her video, Carol Todd came home to find her daughter's body. Amanda had taken her own life. She was 15 years old. The cause of death was officially ruled a suicide by the British Columbia Coroner's Service, though the exact method was not released to the public. Some reports suggested hanging. In the immediate aftermath, police launched a full investigation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and British Columbia Coroner's Service assigned 20 full-time investigators to the case. They reviewed social media content, conducted interviews, examined Amanda's 2 computers, searching for every piece of evidence that might explain what had happened and who was responsible. After Amanda's death, her video exploded across the internet. It was shared millions of times. Within days, it had reached every corner of the globe. People who had never heard of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, watched Amanda's silent testimony and wept. The original video would eventually accumulate over 15 million views. Mirror copies posted by others garnered tens of millions more. A reaction video by a YouTube channel called React, showing teenagers watching Amanda's video, received nearly 45 million views. Amanda's story became a rallying cry. Vigils were held in 38 countries by 2013. She became the 3rd most Googled person in 2012. Over 1 million people liked her Facebook memorial page. But even in death, Amanda couldn't escape the cruelty. Trolls attacked her memorial pages, posting mocking comments and creating insulting images. When one man made derogatory comments about Amanda's death on Facebook, outraged citizens reported him to his employer. The Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, issued a statement. "No one deserves to be bullied. No one earns it. No one asks for it. It is not a rite of passage. Bullying has to stop. Every child has to feel safe at school." In the Canadian House of Commons, parliamentarian Danny Maurian introduced a motion proposing a study of the scope of bullying in Canada and more funding for anti-bullying organizations. It was intended to lay groundwork for a national strategy to prevent bullying. Maureen himself had experienced bullying in school. Carol Todd established the Amanda Todd Trust, later renamed the Amanda Todd Legacy Society, to receive donations supporting anti-bullying awareness, education, and programs for young people with mental health problems. Who was the man who had tormented Amanda so relentlessly? That was the question investigators were determined to answer. Early on, the hacktivist group Anonymous claimed they had identified him, a 32-year-old man from the Vancouver area. They published his name and address online, sparking immediate vigilante threats. The man received over 50 emails and thousands of Facebook death threats. But when police investigated, they found the allegations were unfounded. It was the wrong person. The real predator remained hidden, protected by the anonymity of the internet. The investigation continued. Canadian authorities worked with cybertip.ca, an anti-child exploitation organization, which revealed they had actually received a tip about Amanda nearly a year before her suicide. In November 2011, a concerned citizen had reported that images of Todd were circulating online, but nothing had been done in time to save her. Investigators then turned their attention international. They forwarded their findings to the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Center, attached to the UK's National Crime Agency, which passed the information to authorities in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, police had been tracking a man named Aydin Coben, a Dutch-Turkish dual citizen who lived in Tilburg. Coben, who was in his 30s, made his living repairing computers. He was already under surveillance for suspected involvement in child pornography and sexual exploitation. When Dutch police received information about the Amanda Todd case, they intensified their investigation. They discovered that Coben was connected to 33 other victims across multiple countries: the Netherlands, Norway, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, and Canada. In January 2014, police raided Coben's bungalow home and seized his computer equipment. Among the evidence they found, hard drives containing Amanda Todd's name, fragments of chat logs with her, and most damning, a deleted video file named Amanda Todd, MV, that had been played on one of his devices in December 2010, precisely when Amanda was being actively harassed. Coben was arrested and charged in the Netherlands with indecent assault, production and dissemination of child pornography, fraud, and computer intrusion. The Canadian charges were initially kept separate from the Dutch prosecution. In February 2017, Coben went on trial in Amsterdam. Carol Todd flew to the Netherlands to attend, sitting in the courtroom day after day, watching the man who had destroyed her daughter's life. The evidence against Coben was substantial. He had used sophisticated technology to hide his identity, employing multiple online aliases, masking his location, obfuscating his digital footprint. He had targeted young girls primarily, deceiving them, blackmailing them, destroying their lives for his own gratification. The judge noted the severity of Coben's crimes and the high risk that he would reoffend. On March 16, 2017, Coben was convicted and sentenced to 10 years and 8 months in prison, the maximum sentence under Dutch law for these offenses. But the Canadian charges were still pending. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had charged Coben in 2014 with 5 offenses related to the Amanda Todd case: extortion, 2 counts of possession of child pornography, child luring, and criminal harassment. Coben fought extradition to Canada, but in December 2020, after completing most of his Dutch sentence, he was transferred to Canadian authorities to stand trial. The trial began on June 6, 2022, in British Columbia Supreme Court in New Westminster. Carol Todd attended every single day, sitting at the back of the courtroom, just meters from where Coben sat in the prisoner's box. The Crown prosecutors built their case methodically. They showed how Coben had used 22 different online aliases to communicate with Amanda through Facebook, YouTube, and Skype. They presented evidence of the more than 700 messages he had sent her over more than 2 years of persistent harassment. They showed how he had demanded webcam shows, how he had made relentless online threats, how he had posted and shared suggestive and pornographic images of Amanda when she refused to comply with his demands. They demonstrated how Coben, who was in his 30s during this period, had specifically targeted a vulnerable child. Dutch investigators testified about the evidence found on Coben's computers. RCMP officers who had initially investigated Amanda's harassment allegations in 2000 and 11 testified about what Amanda had told them, that she just wanted it all to stop. Carol and Norm Todd both testified, describing the progressive destruction of their daughter's mental health. Her desperation, her isolation. The defense argued that the Crown had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Cobain was behind all 22 accounts. They questioned whether sharing a link constituted possession of child pornography. They attempted to create reasonable doubt about Cobain's identity as the tormentor, but the evidence was overwhelming. On August 6, 2022, nearly 10 years after Amanda's death, the jury delivered its verdict after just one day of deliberation. Guilty on all 5 counts. Carol Todd, sitting in that courtroom, finally heard the words she had waited a decade to hear. She reacted strongly to each verdict. As it was read, outside the courthouse afterward, she told reporters, "Hearing the guilty counts, there are no words to explain how my heart feels. It's a culmination of what Amanda endured and the truth of it all. If I could say a message to Amanda, it would be that we always believed you." On October 14, 2022, Aidan Cobain returned to court for sentencing. The Crown prosecutors requested 12 years in prison, arguing that Cobain remained unrepentant and posed a high risk to children. The defense asked for 6 years, which they argued should be reduced to 2 years considering the time Cobain had already served in the Netherlands. Justice Martha Devlin had other ideas. She detailed the aggravating factors: Amanda's young age, the sophistication and premeditation of Cobain's scheme, the widespread distribution of pornographic images of the teenager, and the fact that his conduct had contributed to Amanda's suicide. Devlin noted that Cobain had enjoyed his victims' escalating distress and described his conduct as relentless, enduring, and purposely destructive. She quoted from Amanda's video and from the victim impact statements provided by Amanda's family. Then she announced her decision: 13 years in prison. It was more than the Crown had requested. An unusual step that demonstrated the severity of the crimes and the need to send a message to other would-be predators. Ruining Amanda's life was Mr. Cobain's expressly stated goal, and was sadly one that he achieved, Devlin said. Outside the courthouse, Carol Todd held a photograph of her daughter and spoke to reporters. That was amazing. That was amazing because it was justice for Amanda and justice for all. This will make a difference in the world for the kids. And I have to hope Amanda is watching from somewhere to see what her voice did for everyone. Cobain's story didn't end with that sentence. He was returned to the Netherlands to serve his time, as Dutch law required. The Dutch courts then had to convert his Canadian sentence to fit within their legal system. In July 2023, Dutch judges delayed their decision, requesting more information from Canadian authorities. A Dutch prosecutor noted that Dutch courts would typically sentence someone to 4 years for the crimes Cobain had committed against Amanda, less than a third of the Canadian sentence. On December 21, 2023, a Dutch judge reduced Cobain's sentence to 6 years in prison, citing differences in the Dutch legal system. This decision was upheld by the Supreme Court of the Netherlands on January 25, 2025. Carol Todd, while disappointed by the reduction, maintained her focus on the larger mission: preventing other children from suffering as Amanda had. Amanda Todd's story changed the world in ways both large and small. Her video became a teaching tool in schools across the globe. It sparked conversations between parents and children about online safety, about the permanence of digital mistakes, about the importance of seeking help when drowning in despair. In British Columbia and Nova Scotia, anti-cyberbullying laws were passed in direct response to Amanda's case. In February 2024, the federal government tabled Bill C-63, known as the Online Harms Act, which would amend the Criminal Code and Canadian Human Rights Act to introduce heavier sentences for online abuse and create new regulatory bodies to protect people. The case established important legal precedents about extradition for internet crimes, demonstrating that predators could be held accountable across international borders. Carol Todd became close friends with Leah Parsons, whose daughter Rete also died by suicide after online exploitation and bullying. The two mothers frequently speak together about their daughters, emphasizing respect, acceptance, forgiveness, and dignity. In 2018, Canadian composer Jocelyn Morlock won the Juno Award for Classical Composition of the Year for a piece titled "My Name is Amanda Todd." Carol joined her on stage to accept the award. Amanda was described by Vancouver magazine as the girl who woke up the world. And she did. Her silent video, those handwritten cards, that 9-minute cry for help, they reached across the globe and changed how we think about cyberbullying, sextortion, and the vulnerability of children in the digital age. Amanda Todd's story is not an easy one to hear. It's a story of a young girl who made one mistake at an age when we all make mistakes, who was then punished for that mistake every single day for years. It's a story of a predator who saw a vulnerable child and decided to systematically destroy her life for his own satisfaction. But it's also a story of a voice that refused to be silenced. Amanda may have felt she had nobody, that she needed someone and couldn't find them. But in telling her story, she found millions of someones. She found a world that listened, that cared, that said never again. Every time a parent talks to their child about online safety, Amanda's voice is there. Every time a school implements an anti-bullying program, Amanda's voice is there. Every time someone sees another person being harassed online and speaks up instead of remaining silent, Amanda's voice is there. Carol Todd continues her work with the Amanda Todd Legacy Society, speaking at schools, conferences, and events around the world. She has made it her life's mission to ensure that what happened to Amanda helps protect other children. She shares her daughter's story not to dwell in tragedy, but to create hope, to create change, to create a world where children can make mistakes without being destroyed by them. Amanda Todd wanted her voice to matter. She wanted to help other kids avoid the trap she fell into. She wanted people to understand what she had endured. In that, she succeeded beyond measure. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll remember Amanda Todd's story. Not with sadness, necessarily, though there is sadness in it, but perhaps with a sense of the profound impact one voice can have. Even when that voice never speaks a word, Amanda used flashcards in silence, but her message echoed around the world. She told us that the internet is not always safe, that predators exist in digital spaces just as they do in physical ones. She told us that children need protection, that they need someone to listen, someone to believe them when they say they're in trouble. She told us that cyberbullying can kill as surely as any weapon. She told us that cruelty has consequences we can't always see until it's too late. And she told us her name, Amanda Todd. In the quiet of this night, that name remains. A reminder, a warning, a plea, and a legacy that continues to save lives. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded not in some distant, shadowy place, but in the heart of America's heartland, in Columbia, Missouri. This is a story about love that turned cold, about a young woman far from home, and about the relentless pursuit of truth. Let your mind relax as we journey together through this case. There's no need to focus too intently on every detail. Just listen and let the story carry you gently into the night. Our story begins with a woman named Mengqi Ji. In the autumn of 2012, Mengqi Ji, known to her friends as Jessica, arrived in Columbia, Missouri from China. She was 23 years old, bright-eyed, and filled with the kind of hope that comes with starting a new chapter in life. Columbia is a college town, home to the University of Missouri, and it has that particular blend of Midwestern charm and academic energy. For a young woman from Chengdu, in China's Sichuan province, it must have felt both exciting and slightly overwhelming. Mengqi had come to study. She enrolled at the University of Missouri to pursue a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering. It was an ambitious path, one that required dedication and intelligence, both of which Mengqi possessed in abundance. Those who knew her described her as quiet but determined, someone who kept to herself but had a warm smile for those she trusted. Life in a new country isn't easy. There's the language barrier, the cultural differences, the loneliness that can creep in during those first few months. When everything feels unfamiliar, but Mengqi was resilient. She made friends within the Chinese student community, found comfort in familiar foods and customs, and slowly began to build a life for herself in this small Missouri city. Then in 2013, she met Joseph Elledge. Joseph was a graduate student as well, studying at the University of Missouri's College of Engineering. He was an American born and raised in the area, and by all accounts he seemed like a steady, reliable person. He was quiet, somewhat reserved, and to Mengqi, perhaps he represented a bridge between her old world and her new one. They began dating, and their relationship progressed in the way many young relationships do. There were dinners, walks around campus, the ordinary rhythms of two people getting to know each other. By 2014, they had become serious enough that marriage entered the conversation. In August of 2014, Mengqi Ji and Joseph Elledge were married. For Mengqi, this must have felt like a new beginning within a beginning. She was building not just a career, but a family in America. The following year, their daughter Anna was born. Suddenly, Mengqi wasn't just a student and a wife. She was a mother. From the outside, their life might have looked ordinary, even peaceful. Joseph worked as an engineer, and Mengqi balanced her studies with caring for their young daughter. They lived in an apartment, managed their finances, attended to the daily tasks that fill up a life. But inside the walls of their home, something else was happening. Something that those on the outside couldn't see. The truth about a marriage is something that only two people truly know. Friends and family might catch glimpses, small moments that hint at the dynamics at play, but the full picture remains hidden behind closed doors. In the case of Mengqi Ji and Joseph Elledge, what was hidden was dark. As the years passed, Mengqi's life became increasingly isolated. Those who knew her began to notice changes. She seemed withdrawn, more anxious. The bright young woman who had arrived in Colombia with such hope now appeared weighed down by something heavy and unnamed. Later, much later, investigators would uncover evidence that painted a disturbing picture of what life was like for Mengqi. Joseph Elledge, it turned out, was not the steady, reliable partner he appeared to be. Instead, he was controlling and at times violent. There were records, digital footprints that told a story of escalating abuse. Joseph had searched online for information about physical injuries, about how to hurt someone in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible. There were searches about choking, about the physical effects of strangulation, about whether broken bones would show up on x-rays. These weren't the searches of someone casually curious. They were the searches of someone planning, calculating. Mengqi, for her part, had confided in a few people about the difficulties in her marriage. She had mentioned to friends that Joseph could be harsh, that he had hurt her, but like many people in abusive relationships, she was caught in a complex web of fear, hope, financial dependence, and concern for her daughter. Leaving isn't always as simple as walking out the door, especially when you're in a foreign country, when you have a small child, when the person who is supposed to love you has slowly eroded your sense of what's normal and what's not. By October of 2019, Mengqi had made a decision. She wanted a divorce. This is often the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. The moment when the victim asserts their independence, when they try to leave. For someone like Joseph, who thrived on control, this decision would have been intolerable. On the evening of October 8th, 2019, Mengqi Ji was at home with Joseph and their daughter. It was a Tuesday night, unremarkable in most ways. But by the next morning, Mengqi would be gone, and she would never be seen alive again. On October 9th, 2019, Joseph Elledge made a phone call. He called Mengqi's mother, who still lived in China, and told her something that would send ripples of alarm across the ocean. Mengqi, he said, had gone missing. According to Joseph's story, Mengqi had gone out for a walk the previous night. She had left their apartment around 10:30, heading toward Rockbridge Memorial State Park, a wooded area not far from their home. Joseph claimed he had stayed home with their daughter. When Mengqi didn't return, he said he waited. And when morning came and she still wasn't back, he began to worry. He said he had tried to file a missing person report with the Columbia Police Department, but that he had been told he needed to wait 24 hours. This detail would later be disputed. Police would say there is no such waiting period for adults who go missing under suspicious circumstances. Mengqi's mother, thousands of miles away in China, was frantic. She immediately reached out to friends, and members of the local Chinese community in Colombia, asking them to help search for her daughter. Within hours, word had spread. Mengqi Ji, a 28-year-old mother and student, was missing. The Columbia Police Department launched an investigation. They began by interviewing Joseph, trying to piece together a timeline of Mengqi's last known movements. Joseph's story was consistent. Mengqi had gone for a walk late at night, and she simply hadn't come back. He seemed concerned, cooperative even, though there was something about his demeanor that struck investigators as off. He was calm, perhaps too calm for someone whose wife had vanished without a trace. Police searched the area around Rockbridge Memorial State Park. It's a beautiful place, full of trails and caves and the kind of natural beauty that Missouri is known for. But it's also vast and, in places, treacherous. Search teams combed through the woods, checked the trails, looked in the caves. They used dogs, volunteers, and every resource they had available. But they found nothing. No sign of Mengqi Ji. As days turned into weeks, the search continued. But hope began to fade. Where was Mengqi? Had she run away? It seemed unlikely, given that she had left behind her daughter, her documents, and all her belongings. Had she met with an accident in the park? Possible, but wouldn't her body have been found by now? Investigators began to look more closely at Joseph Elledge. They obtained warrants to search his apartment, his car, his phone, and his computer. And what they found there would transform this missing person case into something far more sinister. Inside Joseph Elledge's world, investigators found a trove of disturbing evidence. His internet search history, as I mentioned earlier, was filled with queries about violence and injury. But it went deeper than that. They found that on the night of October 8th, Joseph's phone had been active in the area of Rockbridge Memorial State Park. Cell tower data showed his phone pinging off towers near the park during the late night hours, which aligned with the time he claimed Mengqi had gone for a walk. But here's the thing. Only Joseph's phone was there. Mengqi's phone never left the apartment. Why would Mengqi go for a walk in a remote park at night without her phone? It didn't make sense. And the more investigators dug, the less Joseph's story held up. They examined Joseph's car, a Nissan sedan, and found something crucial. Despite Joseph's claims that Mengqi had walked to the park alone, forensic analysts discovered traces of Mengqi's blood in the rear cargo area of the car. Not a lot, just small traces, but enough to tell a story. Mengqi had been in that car, and she had been bleeding. There were other pieces of evidence, too. Investigators found that Joseph had purchased cleaning supplies in the days following Mengqi's disappearance. He had made multiple trips to stores, buying bleach, heavy-duty trash bags, and other items that could be used to clean up evidence. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed. A clearer picture of the Elledge marriage emerged. People spoke of Joseph's controlling nature, of the way he monitored Mengqi's activities and isolated her from friends. Some mentioned that they had seen bruises on Mengqi, that she had seemed afraid. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from Joseph's own mother. In conversations that were later revealed, Joseph had made comments that suggested guilt and prior knowledge of what had happened to Mengqi. Though he never explicitly confessed, his words carried the weight of someone who knew far more than he was saying. By late October 2019, just weeks after Mengqi's disappearance, Joseph Elledge was arrested. But he wasn't charged with murder. Not yet. There was no body. And while the evidence was damning, prosecutors needed more to build a solid case. Instead, Joseph was charged with child abuse. This charge stemmed from disturbing evidence found on his computer. There were photographs of their daughter, Anna, showing injuries, bruises, and signs of neglect. There were videos, too, showing Joseph handling the child roughly, causing her to cry out in pain. It was clear that whatever darkness had touched Mengqi had also reached their daughter. Joseph was held on bond, but the question remained, where was Mengqi Ji? For more than a year, Mengqi's body remained unfound. Her mother, Shaolin Ji, refused to give up hope. Though as the months passed, that hope became tinged with the grim acceptance that her daughter was likely dead. She traveled from China to Colombia, stood before cameras and pleaded for information, held vigils and pressed law enforcement to keep searching. The Chinese community in Colombia rallied around the case, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, and keeping Mengqi's name in the public eye. But the park where Joseph's phone had pinged that night was vast, and without more specific information, Finding a body seemed nearly impossible. Then in March of 2021, more than a year after Mengqi disappeared, a discovery was made. A man was walking his dog in Rockbridge Memorial State Park along a trail that had been searched multiple times before. The winter had been harsh, with snow and ice covering the ground for months. But now spring was beginning to emerge. The man noticed something unusual partially hidden in the undergrowth, near a steep embankment. He moved closer and realized, with a sickening jolt, that he was looking at human remains. Police were called immediately. The remains were skeletal, scattered by animals, and weathered by time and the elements. But forensic anthropologists were able to piece together enough to make an identification. The remains were those of Mengqi Ji. She had been there all along in the park where Joseph said she had gone for a walk, but she hadn't walked there herself. The evidence suggested she had been placed there, her body hidden in a location that was just off the beaten path. Difficult to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. The cause of death was difficult to determine after so much time had passed. But forensic experts noted fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. With Mengqi's body finally found, prosecutors moved forward. Joseph Elledge was formally charged with first-degree murder and abandonment of a corpse. The trial of Joseph Elledge began in November of 2021, 2 years after Mengqi's disappearance. It was held in Boone County Circuit Court in Columbia, and it drew significant attention both locally and internationally. For Mengqi's family in China, watching via video link, due to the pandemic, it was a chance to finally hear the full story of what had happened to their daughter. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was strong. They presented the cell phone data showing Joseph's movements on the night of October 8th. They showed the blood found in his car. They presented his disturbing internet search history and the evidence of abuse toward both Mengqi and their daughter. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from a forensic podiatrist, an expert in footprints and footwear. This expert testified that boot prints found near where Mengqi's body was discovered matched boots owned by Joseph Elledge. The soil samples from those boots also matched the soil at the site where Mengqi was found. The prosecution argued that on the night of October 8th, Joseph and Mengqi had gotten into a confrontation, likely about her desire for a divorce. In a fit of rage, Joseph had struck Mengqi, causing fatal injuries. He had then placed her body in his car, driven to Rockbridge Memorial State Park in the dark of night, and hidden her remains in the woods. He had then concocted the story about her going for a walk to cover his tracks. Joseph's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof Joseph had killed Mengqi. They suggested that Mengqi might have left voluntarily, that she might have met with an accident, or even that someone else could have been responsible. But these arguments rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. Joseph himself did not testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, but his absence from the witness stand spoke volumes to many observers. The trial lasted just under 2 weeks. Dozens of witnesses testified, hundreds of pieces of evidence were presented, and the jury was tasked with answering a single question: did Joseph Elledge murder his wife? On November 10th, 2021, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of abandonment of a corpse. The courtroom was silent for a moment, and then Mengqi's family, watching from China, wept. It wasn't the first-degree murder conviction prosecutors had sought, but it was justice nonetheless. In February of 2022, Joseph Elledge was sentenced to 28 years in prison. The judge, speaking from the bench, acknowledged the pain that Mengqi's family had endured and the brutality of the crime. He noted that Joseph had not only taken Mengqi's life, but had then tried to erase her, hiding her body and denying her family the ability to grieve properly. Joseph Elledge showed little emotion during the sentencing. He was led away in handcuffs, and the courtroom slowly emptied. And so, the case of Mengqi Ji came to a close, though the pain it left behind continues. For Mengqi's mother, for her family in China, there is some measure of closure in knowing what happened, in knowing that Joseph Elledge is behind bars. But there is also an emptiness that can never be filled. Mengqi was just 28 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her, a daughter who needed her, dreams that would never be realized. This case reminds us of the hidden nature of domestic violence, of how someone can be suffering behind a facade of normalcy. Mengqi's friends and family saw signs, but like so many victims, she may have felt trapped, unsure of how to escape or afraid of what might happen if she tried. It also speaks to the dedication of law enforcement and the community. Without the tireless searching, without the careful forensic work, without the persistence of Mengqi's mother and the Chinese community in Colombia, this case might never have been solved. Mengqi might have remained missing, a name without a story, a question without an answer, but now we know. We know what happened to Mengqi Ji. We know that her life mattered, that her death was not in vain, and that the person responsible has been held accountable. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Mengqi. Remember a young woman who came to a new country with hope, who tried to build a life, who loved her daughter. Remember that behind every true crime story, there is a real person, a real life cut short, and perhaps in remembering we honor them. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to talk about a story that matters. A story about a young woman named Regina K. Walters. Before we begin, know that while this story touches on darkness, it also speaks to perseverance, to the tireless work of those who seek justice, and to the memory of a girl who deserves so much more than the fate she received. So as we settle in, let me tell you about Regina. Regina K. Walters was born on February 7, 1975 in Pasadena, Texas, a city that sits just southeast of Houston, where the humid air hangs heavy in the summer and the highways stretch endlessly in all directions. She grew up in a working-class family, the kind of household where love was present but money was often tight. Regina, who friends called Reggie, had dark hair and eyes that carried both youth and something older, a weariness that some teenagers develop when life asks them to grow up faster than they should. By the time Regina was 13 years old, she found herself navigating the complicated terrain of adolescence without a stable home. Her family life had become fractured. There were difficulties at home, the kind that many families face but few talk about openly. Regina, like so many young people in her situation, was searching for something. Stability, perhaps. Love, certainly. A sense of belonging in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. In 1989, when Regina was just 14 years old, she met a boy named Ricky Lee Jones. Ricky was 16, not much older than Regina, but those 2 years felt significant at that age. He had a quiet intensity about him, a way of making Regina feel seen. They were both restless, both looking for an escape from lives that felt too small, too constraining. And so, as teenagers sometimes do, they made a plan. They would run away together. It was February, the winter of 1990. Regina had just turned 15 years old, less than a week earlier. The details of their departure are sparse, as these things often are. One day they were there, and the next they were gone. They took what little they had and started hitchhiking, thumbs out on the side of the road, trusting in the kindness of strangers to carry them toward whatever future they imagined for themselves. Hitchhiking in 1990 was already understood to be dangerous. This wasn't the 1960s or 70s, when the practice carried a certain countercultural romance. By the 90s, people knew about the risks, but knowledge doesn't always translate to caution, especially when you're young and feeling invincible, or when you're desperate enough that the dangers seem worth the risk. Regina and Ricky traveled through Texas, then crossed into New Mexico. The landscape changed around them, from the flat coastal plains to the stark beauty of the desert. They caught rides from truckers, mostly, those long-haul drivers who traverse the country's interstate system, living in the cabs of their vehicles, eating at truck stops, sleeping in rest areas. For the most part, these drivers were ordinary people doing a difficult job, but not all of them. In early February 1990, somewhere along Interstate 40 or perhaps on one of the state routes that web across New Mexico, Regina and Ricky were picked up by a truck driver. His name was Robert Ben Rhodes, though he wouldn't have introduced himself with his full name. He would have seemed ordinary at first, perhaps even kind. He drove a commercial truck, and he offered them a ride. When you're young and tired and standing on the side of the road, a ride is a ride. Robert Ben Rodas was born on November 22nd, 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He was 44 years old when he picked up Regina and Ricky, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an almost scholarly appearance. He'd been married multiple times. He'd held jobs. He appeared to the casual observer normal. But Robert Ben Rodas had been harboring dark compulsions for many years. Compulsions that he'd learned to hide behind the facade of ordinary life. Rhodes had a particular truck, a commercial rig, that he'd modified for purposes that had nothing to do with hauling freight. In the sleeper cab, that small compartment behind the driver's seat where truckers rest during long hauls, Rhodes had created something horrific. He'd installed restraints, chains, and torture implements. He'd soundproofed the space. He'd transformed what should have been a simple sleeping area into a mobile prison, a place where he could act on his worst impulses without fear of being discovered. The details of what happened to Ricky Lee Jones are not entirely clear, but investigators believe that Rhodes killed the teenage boy relatively quickly, probably within the first day or two after picking up the couple. Ricky's body was found much later, discarded like refuse on the side of a road. His death, while tragic, was likely swift. Regina's ordeal was different. Regina's suffering was prolonged. Rhodes kept Regina captive in that truck for a period that authorities believe lasted weeks, possibly even months. During this time, he photographed her extensively. These weren't ordinary photographs. Rhodes had a compulsion to document his crimes, to create a visual record of the suffering he inflicted. He dressed Regina in different outfits, styled her hair, posed her in various locations. He was treating her like a subject in some twisted art project, exerting total control over every aspect of her existence. One photograph in particular would later become crucial evidence, though it would also become one of the most haunting images associated with this case. In it, Regina stands in what appears to be an abandoned barn. She's wearing a black dress and black heels, clothing that clearly isn't her own. Her hair has been cut short and styled, but it's her face that captures your attention. Her eyes look directly at the camera with an expression that's difficult to fully describe. There's fear there, certainly, but there's also something else, a kind of pleading, a silent communication of terror. This photograph was taken in an abandoned farm building near the small town of Greenville, Illinois. It was one of the last photographs taken of Regina before her death. On September 1st, 1990, a farmer in Millard County, Utah, was checking a section of his property when he discovered something that would alter the trajectory of this case. Hidden in the brush, partially concealed but not well enough, was a body. The remains were badly decomposed, having been exposed to the elements for months, but there were details that could be discerned. This was a young person, likely female, likely a teenager. She'd been murdered. That much was clear. The Utah authorities began their investigation, but without identification, without a name to attach to these remains, the case quickly went cold. The body was classified as a Jane Doe, cataloged, and filed away. Regina's family, meanwhile, had reported her missing months earlier, but the vast distance between Texas and Utah, the limitations of communication systems at the time, meant that no one connected the missing girl from Pasadena with the body found in Millard County. Robert Ben Rodas, meanwhile, continued to drive his routes, continued to hunt. He was a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground in the American interstate system. Truck drivers were everywhere and nowhere, constantly moving, difficult to track. The highways were filled with vulnerable people, hitchhikers, runaways, sex workers, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated with urgency. Rhodes understood this. He exploited it. But even the most careful predators make mistakes eventually. On April 1st, 1990, just 7 months after Regina's body was discovered in Utah, an Arizona state trooper named Mike Miller made a routine stop of a commercial truck on Interstate 10 near Casa Grande, Arizona. It was the kind of stop that highway patrol officers make hundreds of times, checking for paperwork, looking for anything out of the ordinary. But when Trooper Miller approached the truck and began to examine it more closely, he noticed something that seemed off. The truck's logbook showed irregularities. Rodas seemed nervous. Trooper Miller asked for permission to search the vehicle, Rhodes likely calculating that refusing would create more suspicion than complying. Agreed. and when Miller opened the door to the sleeper cab, he discovered a woman inside, naked, chained, and clearly held against her will. Her name was not Regina. Regina was already dead by this point. But this woman was alive, and her rescue would eventually lead investigators to understand the full scope of Robert Ben Rhodes's crimes. The woman found in Rhodes's truck was terrified, but alive. She told investigators that she'd been held captive, tortured, and sexually assaulted over a period of days. Rhodes was immediately arrested on kidnapping and assault charges. As law enforcement began to dig deeper into his background, a disturbing picture emerged. Rhodes wasn't just a truck driver with a dark side. He was a serial predator who'd been operating for years, possibly decades. Investigators found photographs in his possession, dozens of them, depicting young women in various states of distress. Some of these women were identified, many were not. The photographs suggested that Regina and Ricky were not Rhodes's first victims, and the woman rescued in Arizona would certainly not have been his last if he hadn't been caught. Among the photographs was the image of Regina in a black dress, standing in the barn. Investigators recognized that this was important evidence, that this young woman was likely dead, that she represented another victim of Rhodes's compulsions. But identifying her would take time. The process of connecting Rhodes to specific murders was painstaking. He wasn't confessing to anything. He understood the legal system well enough to know that silence was his best strategy. So investigators had to build their case piece by piece, matching photographs to missing persons reports, analyzing locations, establishing timelines. It wasn't until 1992, more than 2 years after Regina's body was discovered in Utah, that authorities were able to make a definitive identification. Dental records, combined with the photographs found in Rhodes' possession and the missing persons report filed by Regina's family, finally put a name to the Jane Doe from Millard County. She was Regina K. Walters, 15 years old at the time of her death. A girl who'd left Texas looking for a better life and instead encountered a monster. Robert Ben Rhodes was charged with the murder of Regina K. Walters. He was also charged with the murder of another young woman named Patricia Walsh and her husband Douglas Ziskowski, a newly married couple who'd been hitchhiking in January 1990, just weeks before Regina and Ricky crossed paths with Rhodes. Like Regina and Ricky, Patricia and Douglas had been trying to get somewhere, chasing dreams of a fresh start. The legal proceedings stretched across years. Rhodes was tried in Illinois for the murders of Patricia and Douglas. In April 1994, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Texas also wanted to try him for the murder of Regina, but legal complications arose. Rhodes was already serving life in Illinois. The resources required to extradite him, try him, and likely sentence him to another life term seemed to some prosecutors redundant. But Regina's family wanted justice. They wanted Rhodes to answer for what he'd done to their daughter. They wanted him to face charges specifically for Regina's murder. And so Texas pursued the case. In 2006, 16 years after Regina's death, Robert Ben Rhodes pleaded guilty to her murder. He was given 2 concurrent life sentences. The plea deal spared him the death penalty, but it also meant he would never leave prison. For Regina's family, the conclusion of the legal case brought a complicated kind of closure. There was relief that Rhodes would never be free, that he would die in prison, but there was also the immutable fact of Regina's absence, the reality that no legal outcome could bring her back or erase the suffering she endured in those final weeks of her life. The question that haunts investigators and true crime researchers is this: how many victims did Robert Ben Rhodes claim? He's been definitively connected to 3 murders: Regina K. Walters, Patricia Walsh, and Douglas Ziskowski. Some investigators believe Ricky Lee Jones should be counted as a 4th. Though Rhodes has never been formally charged with his murder, but those photographs found in his truck suggested more victims. Many more. Some women in those images have never been identified. Their faces stare out from old police evidence photos, frozen in moments of terror, and no one knows their names. No one knows if they survived or if they, like Regina, were killed and their bodies left in remote locations where they might never be found. The FBI eventually came to believe that Rhodes may have been responsible for the deaths of dozens of people over a period of perhaps 15 to 20 years. The exact number will likely never be known. Rhodes won't talk, and the nature of his crimes, the mobility they afforded him, the vulnerability of his victims, means that connecting him to specific disappearances is extraordinarily difficult. There's a chilling calculus to being a serial killer who operates on the highways. The United States has over 46,000 miles of interstate highways, plus hundreds of thousands of miles of state and federal routes. Bodies can be dumped in remote locations and might not be discovered for months, years, or ever. Victims can be picked up in one state and killed in another. Their remains left in a third, making jurisdictional cooperation essential, but complicated. And the people who travel those highways, particularly those who hitchhike, are often already marginalized. People whose disappearances might not trigger immediate intensive investigations. Road aides understood all of this. He exploited all of this. He turned the American highway system, that symbol of freedom and mobility, into his personal hunting ground. And he did it for years before a single traffic stop in Arizona finally ended his reign. It would be easy to let this story end with Rhodes, to make him the center of the narrative. But that would be wrong. This is Regina's story, not his. And so we should spend some time thinking about who Regina was, beyond the circumstances of her death. Regina K. Walters was 15 years old. She liked music, the kind that teenagers in 1990 listened to, the pop and rock that played on the radio. She had friends, though the chaos of her home life sometimes made maintaining friendships difficult. She was trying to navigate the complex transition from childhood to adulthood, trying to figure out who she was and who she wanted to become. When Regina ran away with Ricky, she was doing what teenagers have done for generations. She was asserting independence, making choices that felt empowering even if they were dangerous. She was, in her own way, trying to write her own story. The tragedy is that she never got the chance to see how that story might have unfolded if she hadn't crossed paths with Robert Ben Rhodes. Her family remembers her as more than a victim. They remember her laugh, her stubbornness, the particular way she had of looking at the world. They remember the ordinary moments that make up a life. Family dinners, arguments over small things, plans and dreams that now exist only in memory. The photograph of Regina in the barn, the one that became evidence in the case against Rhodes, is difficult to look at, but it's important to remember that this single image, this moment of captured terror, doesn't represent the totality of Regina's life. It represents only the end, only the worst thing that ever happened to her. The other 14 years and 11 months of her life, all the moments that came before Rhodes, those matter too. Those are the parts of Regina's story that should be remembered alongside the tragedy of her death. Regina's case opened up larger questions about safety, about vulnerability, about how we as a society protect or fail to protect young people who find themselves in desperate situations. In 1990, resources for runaway teenagers were limited. There were shelters in some cities, hotlines that provided some help, but the network of support was threadbare at best. Since then, there have been improvements. The National Runaway Safe Line provides crisis intervention and support. There are more resources for teenagers in crisis, more public awareness about the risks of hitchhiking, more coordination between law enforcement agencies when it comes to tracking missing persons. But gaps remain. Thousands of people go missing every year. Many of them are young, many are women, many are from marginalized communities. Not all of these cases receive equal attention or resources. The phenomenon that activists and researchers call missing white woman syndrome reflects a reality where some victims receive extensive media coverage while others are barely noted. Regina's case, while ultimately solved, initially suffered from this disparity. She was a runaway, a troubled teenager, someone who might have been judged as having made bad choices. That judgment can affect how seriously a case is taken. The women and men who travel the highways, either by choice or necessity, remain vulnerable. Sex workers, homeless individuals, hitchhikers, they all face elevated risks. And while Robert Ben Rhodes is behind bars, he's not the only predator who's recognized the opportunities that highway travel presents. The FBI maintains a highway serial killings initiative, dedicated tracking and solving murders connected to the interstate system. As of recent reports, they've identified hundreds of potential victims and dozens of potential suspects in highway-related serial killings. Robert Ben Rhodes is currently incarcerated in the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, a maximum security prison where he's serving his life sentences. He's in his late 70s now, an old man who will die in prison. He's never expressed remorse for his crimes. He's never provided information that would help solve other cases or identify other victims. He remains to the end committed to his silence. In some ways, his continued life is frustrating to those who believe in capital punishment, who feel that someone who caused so much suffering should pay with his own life. In other ways, his imprisonment is a different kind of justice. Every day he wakes up in a cell, unable to hunt, unable to harm is a day that potential victims are safe from him. And perhaps there's something fitting about him spending his final years in the kind of confinement he once inflicted on others, even if prison is nothing like the mobile torture chamber he created in his truck. The photograph of Regina continues to circulate, unfortunately, on various true crime websites and forums. There are debates in the true crime community about whether such images should be shared, whether they serve a purpose in education and awareness, or whether they simply exploit victims all over again. Regina's family has expressed their wish that people remember Regina as she was in life, not as she appears in that final photograph. It's a request worth honoring, and so we come to the end of Regina's story, or at least to the end of what we know about it. The facts have been laid out, the timeline established, the resolution such as it is reached. But facts alone don't capture the full weight of what happened. A 15-year-old girl, barely more than a child, was tortured and murdered. A boy of 16 met a similar fate. Two newlyweds trying to start their life together were killed. And there are others, unknown numbers of others, who crossed paths with a predator and never made it home. These aren't just statistics or case studies. They're absences, holes in the fabric of families and communities. They're futures that never materialized, potential that was never realized. They're grief that doesn't fade, that becomes part of the landscape of daily life for those left behind. If you're listening to this as you fall asleep, perhaps these thoughts seem heavy. Perhaps you're wondering why anyone would choose to hear about such darkness before drifting off. But there's something to be said for bearing witness, for refusing to let victims become nameless, faceless statistics. Regina K. Walters was real. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And remembering her, saying her name, keeping her story alive, that's a small act of resistance against the oblivion that people like Robert Ben Rhodes try to create. The highways still stretch across the country, endless ribbons of asphalt connecting cities and towns. Trucks still rumble along them at all hours, carrying goods from coast to coast, and people still travel those routes, some in cars, some still hitchhiking despite the risks. The landscape hasn't changed that much since 1990, but Regina isn't on those roads anymore. She's buried in Texas, back in the place she tried to leave. Her family visits when they can. They leave flowers, they remember, and tonight, so have we. We've spent this time together thinking about Regina, about what happened to her, about the circumstances that led a young girl to be on the side of a road where a predator found her. It's a heavy story, yes, but it's also an important one. As you drift off to sleep now, let Regina rest too. She deserves that peace, that rest after everything she endured. And perhaps tomorrow, if you think of her story, you'll think too about being kind to the young people in your life who are struggling, about supporting systems that protect vulnerable people, about paying attention to those who might otherwise go unnoticed. Sleep well, and may Regina K. Walters rest in peace. Good night.